War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 27, Analysis of the Falklands Campaign. Of what good is experience without reflection? This paraphrasing, often attributed to John Dewey, but repeated throughout history in various ways, shows the limitation of the study of history in the absence of understanding the principles of war, which drove so much of history. In this week's podcast, I'll attempt to analyze at each level of war the principles of war from each of the belligerents' perspective, and from each of the domains, and in such a way as to give maximum benefit of the doubt to the leaders who made the call, as, ultimately, they were the men in the arena. Furthermore, how these lessons still apply today, and should shape our analysis of current conflicts. To start with is, of course, the grand strategy. As the Argentinians initiated the conflict, we should start there. The conquest or reconquest of the Malvinas is one of the few unifying foreign policy constants of Argentinian administrations, running the gamut from fascists to communists and now to libertarians. In order for anything to become a grand strategy, it must resonate with the population. It must be as much a cultural objective as a political one. As such, it is the level of war which leans most heavily on the passionate side of the Clausewitzian paradoxical trinity. It is inherently simple, which renders friction almost irrelevant. That being said, the application of the grand strategy at the political and strategic levels can be the most complicated. Friction always waits, and as it is swayed far more by the emotions of myth, rationality has nearly nothing to do with it. It is politically quite rational to support an irrational grand strategy, however. I could spend an hour talking about the various claims to sovereignty on the Falklands. Argentina's claims rest on the actions prior to 1833, effectively. Since then, the Falklands have been populated by settlers from Great Britain, who see themselves as British. For Argentina, they see the Falklands as a colony, and their actions part of the decolonization movement which accelerated after World War II, inherently righteous. For the British, they see the Falklands as British territory, and a grand strategy of defending Britain and British territory against foreign aggression is likewise inherently righteous. One of the huge problems with grand strategy, so dependent upon the myths and half-truths that create it, is they often neglect and ignore the enemy when developing the policies and strategies that flow from grand strategy, particularly in the case of Argentina. Having seen the British Crown relinquish such jewels as India and Kenya, South Africa, and Palestine, they assumed that Britain would have no real interest in the Falklands, but they neglected to differentiate between the modern usage of colony as a conquest of empire and the literal definition dating to the Greeks and Romans of citizens from the metropolis, literally mother city, founding a new city from what is known as terra nullius, or territory belonging to no one. In the case of the aforementioned jewels, there were established populations of indigenous nations predating the conquest and colonization of Great Britain. While Argentina saw themselves as the indigenous population, their claim was scant in comparison to the Hindus, Bantus, and others from the jewels. The Argentinians seemingly assumed that the Falklands were no different, and thus Britain had neither true interest nor legitimate claim in retaining them. The absence of a clear-cut grand strategy or policy vis-a-vis the Falklands that transcended clear messaging between Labour and Tory governments only exacerbated the misunderstanding. It was, in fact, quite clear that the previous Labour governments were all too happy to abandon the Falklands and their British inhabitants. This lack of clear grand strategy led to a policy inconsistency that favored bold action on the part of the Argentinians. As unity of command is a principle of war, the lack of consistency inherent in functioning democracies can, in fact, lead to war. History is rife with changing political winds blowing invariably to what would otherwise be avoidable conflict. The policy of both was straightforward and proven by the post-bellum results. The Argentinian junta was on thin ice, politically speaking. Having overthrown Juan Perón's widow, Isabel, the fifth-grade dropout and nightclub dancer who served as vice president to her husband and then president for 2 years, they had seized power promising reform, but, as usual, not delivering. The invasion of the Falklands was hugely popular with the Argentinian population at the time, and the initial success and subsequent public support seemed to justify the policy. The loss did the opposite. All remaining support for the junta crumbled, and by 1983, elections were held, and the Socialist Party, which solely opposed the invasion at the time, was elected. Nearly all the various leaders of the junta, for whom leadership positions were changed annually, were tried and convicted for decades-long sentences. As for Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government, their popularity soared. Thatcher seized on that popularity, calling for elections the next year, and her party was given its largest majority since 1924, with a 60-seat improvement from the previous election. If there is a common thread politically to war, is that while going to war is generally popular, winning a war is immensely popular. Conversely, avoiding a war avoids political gain, but likewise avoids the almost universally disastrous outcome from losing a war. So always beware the unpopular government with a war they can justify, even if they can't win it. Strategically, the Argentinians were hampered by the blindness of their grand strategy. They had convinced themselves the British wouldn't fight for the Falklands. It wasn't a bad assumption, but whenever you plan a war, invasion, battle, or vacation, every assumption requires a branch plan. So a quick doctrinal explanation. A branch plan is a less detailed plan created when you make an assumption, which drives you in a certain direction, just in case the assumption turns out wrong. So you have a backup plan, in other words. I don't know if the Argentinians made any branch plans. As noted, their initial invasion, albeit against token defenses, was nearly flawless. They then distributed their forces as more occupiers rather than focusing on defeating a counterattack. Strategically, these weren't economy of forces. The regiment at Goose Green and other smaller detachments were too big for mere outposts and simply distracted from massing forces at the strategic center of gravity at Port Stanley. Had the Argentinians effectively prepared to defend Port Stanley, they would have massed more armored forces as mobile reserves capable of decisive counterattacks. They didn't. They abandoned all mobility and entrusted to their dug-in drafty infantry to win the day. Against a lesser foe than the professional British paras, commandos, and their 5th Infantry Brigade, this might have won, but here we are. At sea, the Argentinians were lost. They failed to mass or even attack, staying at sea for no discernible purpose other than as a show of force. But 10 ships versus the Royal Navy wasn't much of a show, especially when their fleet, a term loosely used here, was split in two. As noted, there's no such thing as defense afloat. You either fight or run. They started out doing neither and ended up running in the end. Their air attacks against the British fleet were, likewise, disjointed and without clear purpose. Their most powerful weapon, the exocets, were too few in number, and they failed to mass their attacks. The 2 attacks against the Hermes were days apart, with both attacks failing to hit their target, but admittedly sinking 2 other ships. It wasn't until after the Belgrano was sunk that they decided to counter the Royal Navy. A strategy of mass, with the Belgrano support ships and their surface-launched exocets, with air attacks from aircraft off the De Mayo aircraft carrier and shore-based daggers, A4s, and the Super Entenards would have been, strictly from a naval strategy perspective, probably the right course. However, and this could never have been far from the junta's mind, they were at war with a nuclear weapon-armed country. The Argentinians could not know how far they could push it. These international political considerations must have limited their strategy options. Las Malvinas were not worth a mushroom cloud over Buenos Aires. Even if the odds of this happening were small, they were never zero. The entire Argentinian policy was to minimize the damage done to British prestige while still controlling the Falklands, which meant going to war but hoping your enemy would never reciprocate. In retrospect, they should have cut a deal as soon as the Royal Navy sailed if they weren't willing to go all the way. The British strategy was sound: gain sea control, land forces in a safe harbor, marshal the requisite logistics, and seize Port Stanley. As the British obtained their policy objectives, there's little to criticize here. They fought a capable foe and took casualties. But their overall plan remained intact, and despite some operational setbacks, was executed near perfectly. Operationally, the Argentinians failed to take the opportunity to harden the island's defenses properly as soon as they gained control. Had Argentina prepared for a spirited defense from the outset, the odds of British success would have fallen precipitously. Launching daggers and Skyhawks from Argentina and not upgrading the Port Stanley airport may have been their biggest failure. Likewise, more armored forces with the required logistics would have nullified the superior training of the British light infantry forces. Once Great Britain sank the Belgrano and gained sea control, these options were off the table. Despite the nightly Argentinian C-130 flying into Port Stanley every day of the war, there was little Argentina could do to improve their position. In isolation, the British maintained a high tempo operationally, which I disagree with from a purely military perspective. A tactic of embargo would have attrited the Argentinian forces and made the reconquest of the Falklands far easier. However, the harsh nature of the South Atlantic in winter would have greatly challenged the Royal Navy. Likewise, it was impossible to make the Argentinian forces on the Falklands suffer without likewise making the native Falklanders suffer as well. Politically, if the justification for the reconquest was to protect these subjects of the crown, an operational concept which made them suffer would be politically untenable for Thatcher, who was under pressure from the media and the opposition to quickly end the war, which she did. But the casualties suffered by the British military were, to a large degree, a result of the rushed nature of the British campaign. As for the flagship Hermes and her little sister Invincible, the two Royal Navy aircraft carriers, they were deemed so critical as to effectively remove them from the decisive fight in and around San Carlos and ultimately Port Stanley. Their air wings and support ships existed largely to protect them. In a more modern phrase, they became self-licking ice cream cones. Again, a violation of mass. But this operational view must be handled with an eye towards the political reality. Had either of them been sunk, it would have been exceedingly hard on the Thatcher administration to maintain support in Parliament and in the streets of England. That being said, had both been removed entirely from the flotilla and all support ships massed with the landing ships and troop carriers, the end result would have been the same. The Sea Harriers were effective air defense aircraft and did provide some strike and close air support, but the frigates and destroyers could have provided roughly the same effect with less risk. As with all criticisms of the British strategy, operational concepts, and tactics, one is forced to always admit they won. Tactically, the Argentinians, as noted, failed to mass their forces around Port Stanley, but they did establish solid defenses that were doctrinally sound. Their absence of tactical mobility, however, meant they would inevitably lose due to the fire superiority of the British, specifically with their naval gunfire. The artillery duel was over before it started. Their air attacks were disjointed, targeting, at different times and with different means, the aircraft carrier Hermes, the air defense screening ships, and troop carriers. Any one of these is a valid priority. The Hermes more for its symbolism, the air defense screening ships in an attempt to gain control of the air, or the troop landing ships, as they were necessary means to land the infantry. But the Argentinians never prioritized any of them, and thus failed to eliminate any of them. The abject failure of the Argentinian fusing of their bombs is criminal. Had the bombs exploded, it's arguable the British would have sustained losses, making the retaking of the islands impossible. Of course, the British could have carried the fight to Argentina and waged war there to inflict enough pain to make Argentina beg for terms, making the squeeze far in excess of the juice. This escalation would have carried significant political risks, however. The British ground operations suffered from a lack of patience, again, possibly from fear of both the South Atlantic winter as well as political pressure, both domestic and international. The longer the Argentinians controlled Port Stanley, the stronger the argument for peaceful reconciliation became. The attack at Goose Green was unnecessary. A simple screening movement could have protected the flank of the advancing commandos. With command of the air and sea established over East Falklands, the draftees would have been easy fodder had they tried to push a flanking offensive. The long distance from San Carlos to Port Stanley likewise may have been unnecessary, as the British did ultimately disembark 5th Brigade from the far closer Bluff Cove, albeit with disastrous results on the troop-carrying ships. The poor performance of both the British air defense missiles and the Argentinian bombs were ample displays of Clausewitzian friction, rendering what might have been a successful strategy on the Argentinian side irrelevant. But, for the losses suffered on Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram, Bluff Cove proved to be a suitable landing spot and would have placed the British infantry only a day's march from Port Stanley. The final assaults on 11 June on Mount Harriet, Two Sisters, and Mount Longdon appear to be the most foolish. Why all three had to be attacked simultaneously seems unclear. It forced the British to attack with a 1-to-1 ratio, and 2 of the 3 attacks were frontal assaults against a dug-in enemy on high ground. The attack by 42 Commando on the southern edge of the Three Mountains could have been an opening for the entire brigade to bypass the defenses on Longdon and Two Sisters, isolating the defenses and cutting them off without the brutal direct assaults. Indeed, a blocking position southeast of Mount Harriet would appear, based on the map, to have been enough to allow the entire Commando Brigade to march straight for Stanley and avoid the secondary objective of Mount Tumbledown, with Sapper Hill being the sole objective for the entire brigade. I was not there, and I must defer to the commander on the ground who won the war. But as a mental exercise for the student, I consider it. The objective was Port Stanley. I think there was some loss of focus on that for a destruction of the dug-in enemy. Clausewitz and Liddell Hart clashed, and Clausewitz came out on top. Yet another irony for the British forces. In the end, the British won, and the leadership, both political and military, reaped the benefits. The losing Argentinians lost, and likewise paid a penalty. Ultimately, the Argentinian loss was caused by a misunderstanding of the British grand strategy vis-a-vis the Falklands in light of the cultural imperatives of the British people themselves. This failure to understand your enemy's culture and grand strategy is often the greatest fault of aggressors in war and provides a good framework for discussing the current conflict in and around Israel today, which we will discuss next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.